Thanks for being here, everyone. I'm Adrienne Lindsay. I'm the Director of the Center for Substance Use Training and Telementoring at Be Well, Texas. Welcome to our Texas session, After a Disaster, Connecting Survivors to Essential Behavioral Health Services. If you haven't joined us for a Texas session before, these are our webinars that we hold in between the Texas Substance Use Symposia to keep the conversation going, bring critical information to everyone. So we appreciate you being here. Couple quick housekeeping items. Please feel free to put your comments, your thoughts in the chat box. And if you'd like to ask a question of our presenter, you can use that Q&A feature. It's available down at the bottom. If you just kind of hover your mouse over the bottom of your screen, it should pop up, and you can put those in at any time. We'll be taking questions at the end. And then just be aware everyone's video and audio is turned off so we can hear our speaker today. And we will also be recording today's session. So if you would like to watch it again, share with a colleague who maybe couldn't be here, you will have that available to you on the Texas website. All right, another quick announcement. Please save the date for our Texas Substance Use Symposium 2026. We appreciate everyone's patience as we postponed the 2025 event due to a number of policy and funding changes, but we are back and we're looking forward to seeing everyone again. We'll be in San Antonio next year at the Henry B. Convention Center, and that is right on the Riverwalk. So we hope folks will join us. You should be seeing a call for proposals as well as registration coming out this fall. Okay, the usual disclosures. The views and opinions of our speakers are solely their own. They don't necessarily reflect those or the official position of UT Health San Antonio or UT System. Okay, I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today, Brenda Mannix. I want to say a little bit first about the purpose of this session. I know we had our hill country floods this year. We're in the midst of hurricane season. We've had other major disasters in Texas in the last several years. And I know this has been on the hearts and minds of many behavioral health professionals, which is what can we do to be better prepared in our field? And how can we best respond during and after a disaster? So we hope that this content will be helpful to you, and really this is just the beginning of the conversation. So let me tell you a little bit about Brenda before she pulls up her slides. She brings 30 years of experience in emergency and disaster preparedness and response. She's served in a number of high-level leadership positions at the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, and SAMHSA's Disaster Technical Assistance Center. She's been involved in responses to hurricanes Katrina, Rita, and Wilma, as well as 9/11. And she is a social worker by training and retired EMS lieutenant, and many, many other things. That's a short list of all of her accomplishments and her experience, but I don't want to take up too much time. We want to dive into her content. So Brenda, I will turn it over to you for your presentation, and then we'll take some questions at the end.
Thank you so much for having me. It's good to be back in Texas, even if it is only virtual. I was thinking about it as I was getting ready to come, and I realized I have actually never been to Texas outside of a disaster. I think I need to make a practice of coming.
Yes, we will gladly welcome you.
I can't tell if you guys can see this or not because it just literally overtook my whole screen.
We can't see your slides yet.
Okay, let me get that back up. Sorry. Share. Now let me get you to this one. Okay, that better. That worked, it seems.
Perfect.
Okay, so as Adrienne mentioned, I have a lot of background in disaster relief. And when we talked a little bit about getting ready for this presentation and kind of the challenges that Texas has been experiencing this year, we identified these key learning objectives, identifying the stages of disaster recovery, especially as it relates to people's behavioral health reactions, and some of the strategies we can use to enhance or support them through those reactions, understanding the incident command system and knowing who to contact and how that works, recognizing and applying strategies to adapt the behavioral health services to meet your client's needs. You know, honestly, any one of these is like 3 different classes that could take several hours at a time. In fact, they are taught as separate classes typically. So we're going to try and get as much of this in as possible into our hour together. So we're going to start with what is a disaster. It seems like it's should be pretty easy for people to kind of define on their own, but there's some really key differences that have been coming out over the last, I don't know, probably 20 years, but that are really quite striking, and how we define them and how we determine one has occurred. And, so I have FEMA's here, which I wanted to point out has been updated a couple of different times. But the one that's struck me right here is in any part of the United States, regardless of cause, any fire, flood, or explosion. So when I first started working at FEMA, that didn't exist in the definition, which is interesting because we'd by that point already had the Oklahoma City bombing, which was declared a major disaster. I was actually working a field office in Iowa after the Midwest floods when that event occurred. So that definition actually came after 9/11. It got updated and added that. And yet it still doesn't encompass everything that FEMA has actually had to do. The pandemics, why should they be involved in declaring a major disaster after a pandemic? You would think that should go into the public health emergency, and it does. But it's just kind of a way that FEMA and the United States government can send out resources to communities. So we'll talk a little bit about that later in the presentation about the different types of resources that become available when FEMA does declare a disaster. I like the United Nations one because it could potentially apply to anything. School shootings, mass shootings of any kind don't apply under the FEMA disaster. And there are other programs, so to speak, for responding to those types of things, but it typically is just not covered. So I like that the United Nations is a little bit more encompassing of any potential hazard that just overwhelms a community's resources and leads to significant impacts. SAMHSA DTAC, which is the Disaster Technical Assistance Center, is funded by both FEMA and SAMHSA to provide technical assistance to states and communities on disaster preparedness as well as disaster response and recovery. So they've basically modified the definition just a touch in order to kind of recognize the disasters FEMA has been involved in already and the types of support that they have had to develop resources and materials for. But practically speaking, some of the things that we kind of keep in the back of our minds, we want to keep in the back of our minds, is all disasters are local, right? It can be a major disaster like a Hurricane Katrina or Rita or Wilma or even the Central Texas floods of today. But the effects that you're going to see are going to be different across certain communities. And that's going to be very specific to the geographical, cultural, and economic realities in those communities. That's why we say they're so local, even if they are considered major or national disasters. I call them unbiased. Their disasters are more than willing to hit anybody, but the effects are not equal. And I think we're really starting to pay attention to how true that is. And when we talk about resilience in these communities and resilience at individual levels, we can't deny that some of our communities are in different places of resilience because there is an unequal amount of resources in these communities. And that becomes more stark and profound after a disaster. And then disasters are influenced by humans, even the natural ones. And what we mean by that is we used to make a distinction between a natural disaster and a human-caused disaster, meaning something like terrorism or, somebody, intentionally sabotaged a levee. But what we're realizing is that even natural disasters have a human element in their causation simply by things like building codes. My first big natural disaster as a FEMA employee was actually Hurricane Andrew, and building codes became a huge conversation there because would the devastation have been as bad if they had all of those houses or communities up to hurricane standards for protection, tie downs for the roofs and the structure, specific glazing standards for the windows so they wouldn't shatter so easily. We did the same thing after earthquakes. We updated fire codes. She mentioned that I also work in EMS and fire. 90% of our fire and rescue services calls are actually medical. The fires are very few because we've done so good with building codes and building standards with automatic suppression systems. Although I will say that when it does really catch on, it burns fast. So most recently, you guys had a disaster in Central Texas. It was, I mean, we've seen it all over the news everywhere. This is a kind of a picture of the disaster declaration zone. And what those different colors mean are the different types of designations FEMA made. And again, we'll go into a little bit more detail about the difference between the individual assistance program and the public assistance programs a little bit later in the presentation, but I wanted you to see what that means. And you can, a county that is included can get one of those or both of those designations at the same time. So it's unique to that. The other thing I noticed is, and just kind of looking at, I mean, Texas is, I know, no stranger to disasters. You certainly have, a wide variety of types of events that can occur there. But in this year so far, this is actually your 8th disaster. And that not all of them may have made the news the way the central floods did. This was actually your second set of floods. The first one was in March in the 4 southernmost counties. And then you've had 6 fire disasters. So this is only the 8th, and may all of the hurricanes stay out to sea this year. So kind of giving that as our backdrop and how we're going to start as our context, let's talk about what happens when people experience a disaster in terms of their psychological reaction, their emotional reaction. In many years of working in this field, one of the things that we've noticed is that the psychological reactions tend to have a bit of a delay in kicking in. And part of that is because if you think very simply about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the first things that we're always going to be worried about is food, shelter, clothing, and safety and security, right? Those basic needs have to be met before we can worry about how we feel about things or be able to process the other types of experiences that might have occurred during that disaster, like the sense of fear, the loss and grief that we might have experienced. So keeping all of that in mind, we kind of have a mapping, and this is not nearly as linear as this, graphic looks. People can move back and forth, not only at the individual level, but a whole community level. And so we have impact. Think of that as day 0. And then right now, you're almost 60 days past that for your central Texas flooding disaster. And then moving out, we go all the way out to the one-year anniversary. We often see for big disasters, especially, a lot of anniversary type reactions. We see a lot of anniversary events. I mean, this is actually in a few days is the 20th anniversary of the Hurricane Katrina disaster. And so for a long time, that worked in the crisis counseling program, we assumed that, the anniversary was a huge deal. We really needed to pay a lot of attention to that. And then through almost 35 years worth of data from that program and looking at how people respond, and we're finding that the anniversary is actually kind of specific to communities. Also, it's a cultural thing. Some people want to acknowledge an anniversary event, a reaction, and some people don't. And some people have very little reaction. But what we did find is the small percentage of people who have very strong reactions after the anniversary, at the anniversary time, have very distressing reactions, and that they are usually the people who were also most impacted, had the most vulnerability for developing a longer term disorder, so to speak. So we move through these. You kind of have your warning and threat. Obviously, you could think anxiety is going up. When we think emotional high and low, we don't want to necessarily think of them as positive and negative in that way, because you can be emotionally high and still be anxious. So up to that impact point, you might have a real emotional high as well, of that anxiety increasing in anticipation of what's going to happen and whether or not we're prepared enough. I know a lot of people sometimes say, well, we're kind of used to it down here. And I don't know that we ever really get used to it. I think we can get better prepared. But I think the idea that, every one of them is going to happen a little bit differently, and then there's always that one that surprises us that is so much worse than anybody anticipated. So I think we get better prepared. I don't know that we actually get used to it, but maybe everybody can define it for themselves. After the impact, we have what we typically see is that heroic phase where everybody's kind of pulling together. That's where we're really seeing a lot of the rescues, the heroics of people. I remember Katrina and the Cajun Navy, the pictures of them going out and assisting. Saw the same thing in all of the footage from the Central Texas floods of your citizens just really going out of their way to help each other. And then you have that honeymoon phase at that as it's kind of its peak, is that sense of community cohesion and that we're all working together for the same thing and towards the same goal. And then the long process of recovery and rebuilding starts to kick in, and we start to see kind of some disillusionment that happens. And some of that's weak. This is where I say a lot of what happens after a disaster is what we call those problems of living. It's maybe we're still out of work, maybe we're still struggling with the insurance adjuster, maybe we're still struggling to get our FEMA check or whatever it is, but the kids are still out of school and I'm trying to work and there's nobody to watch them. It's all of those challenges that just start to pile up, and that's a pretty significant factor in it isn't just what happened during the disaster and the reactions to that. It is everything that comes afterwards in terms of the process of recovery that then also adds to the different ways in which people respond emotionally. So that's that disillusionment phase. Then at the anniversary reaction, we see two things. You kind of see this inverse reaction where sometimes it's really low, but sometimes it's actually not. It really, we're finding it's a lot more community specific, and then also to some extent individual specific, and in that sometimes the anniversary reaction becomes the celebration and not a memorial. It also depends on disaster type. The celebration of look how far we've come, and have we come back stronger and better as a community. Some communities do, some communities do not, and so I think anniversary reactions again are going to be very local and very specific to that community. And then the reconstruction phase, we say that's the new reality. It's the new beginning. We used to say we're going to get you to your pre-disaster state of functioning, but the reality is maybe that wasn't that great either. So the new beginning, or it's your new normal, is whatever that's going to be. Even rebuilding your house, your community may not feel the same. The house may not feel the same. It might have been something that was something your great grandfather built by hand, and now, I mean, you're still in the same plot, but it's not the same house. It doesn't come with the same memories. So that new beginning can be working through grief and coming to acceptance and a sense of understanding that this is where we're going to be going from here. All right, make sure I covered all that. So we're going to pop up a poll, kind of getting your sense from your experience, especially if you're been involved in one of those communities that's experienced a disaster recently, of where you think your community is or where you are personally. You can answer it either as an individual or on behalf of where you think the community might be. So we're going to pop that question up and have you just take a few seconds. Don't overthink it. Just put in your gut instinct and let's see where you guys feel like you are in terms of a recovery process.
One moment here, Brenda, we're getting that poll launched.
Mm-hmm. So when you feel like we have enough respondents, we can go ahead and show that to our group. Okay. And honestly, this is actually what I typically see when I do this poll and trainings. I often train states new crisis counselors right after they've gotten a disaster and they're getting their crisis counseling program up and running. This is part of one of those trainings, and I often do this poll, and I often see this, even though it's literally just happened for them, it's still typically 4 to 5 months away from when the disaster hit when we're doing these trainings. And I still see the whole gamut of responses of where people are. And I think that's important because not everybody's going to be in the same place. And it underpins that point I made earlier about the disaster effects are not equal. So thank you for participating in that. Okay. So the behavioral health response. So everyone is affected in some way. Not always bad, right? So some people actually do quite well after a disaster and they really become closer with somebody they hadn't before or with their family. And then others just do worse. It just is really very specific. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of those things that affect how people end up responding. Stress and grief are common after a disaster, obviously. And then people's natural resilience supports individual and community recovery. And what we mean by that is the vast majority of people are going to be fine after a disaster, emotionally, mentally. We're not going to, you don't tend to see long-term disorders developing specifically from, a disaster at a large scale or a large percentage of people. There is a small but very important percentage of people who do go on to develop ultimately some sort of mental health disorder or substance use disorder, but that is not actually the norm. The norm is that most people will be fine and they pull together and they figure it out, and a minimal amount of support can go a long way. Or so the types of reactions that we typically see run the gamut of emotional, physical, mental, and cognitive, and behavioral, of course. Anything from, poor sleep, changes in appetite, the emotional side of anxiety and fear, euphoria, apathy is one. Sometimes survivor's guilt is one. Mental or cognitive is a little bit different in that, disorientation, difficulty. I would consider those pretty severe reactions. And anybody I came across while doing some outreach who's having that kind of reaction, I'd be sending to the hospital for an evaluation because it disorientation to that level signifies a pretty substantial deterioration in their ability to function and care for themselves. So I'd want to make sure that there's nothing physically underpinning that before assuming that there's a behavioral health reaction happening there. But of course, trauma can do that. It can be kind of a dissociative experience, still a pretty severe reaction that we want to be on the lookout for. I used to joke that this crisis counseling program is the original SBIRT program, screening, brief intervention, referral to treatment. And that's what we do in that program is we do some screening. And if we see somebody who's really struggling, we want to make sure we get them to the highest level of the most appropriate level of care as quickly as possible. Alcohol and drug misuse or use can increase from previous use or start new. Relapse is certainly a problem and can be a problem for some individuals, especially those who might be new to recovery. Declining job performance, frequent crying, avoidance type behaviors are somewhat common after a disaster, at least in the initial phases. When people finally have chance to attend to their emotional reaction is when we might start seeing that. So let's see. And then the severe reactions, substance use or misuse, depressive disorders, we don't diagnose in the CCP program. There really isn't a need to, for the most part. It doesn't mean that people don't have the potential to have one. You could see some reactions that are severe enough that when you refer them to treatment, they ultimately get a diagnosis, such as acute stress disorder. But a lot of the reactions are temporary. They are appropriate to the disaster response and the phase of where people are. But if they're severe enough to interfere with their ability to care for themselves, take on the tasks that they need to take in order to continue their physical recovery, their housing, jobs, applying for benefits, things like that, then we're having a very severe reaction. Um, One of the things that we've noticed in the CCP program too is that we find a lot of people who probably have an underlying or had before to the disaster an underlying behavioral health disorder that had never been diagnosed nor treated. They had had no interaction with the behavioral health system prior to this. And so we see a lot of like first time encounters that way, and where people probably would have benefited from treatment sooner, but through the CCP, we're finally either willing or able or accepting of the idea that treatment might be a positive thing in their life, and less resistant to it. So that is one of the things that I'm going to mention again, is that stigma actually reduces for a period of time after a disaster. So individual characteristics that increase severity or the vulnerability to severe reactions or having a severe reaction. Poverty or low socioeconomic status is one of the key indicators. Race, age, ethnicity, unemployment, gender, and then immunocompromised status. We used to say older adults. You notice age is actually kids. It's not, and it's parents. This is again the benefit of research going on over time. We used to think it was older adults, and it turns out older adults are not more vulnerable unless they are disabled and shut in, and more at risk than of being closed off from community resources, contact with people that helps them with their mental health in general. But parents ended up being a pretty significantly impacted because they're trying to recover on multiple levels. And if they're a sandwich generation, they've got elderly parents they're taking care of, they've got young kids they're taking care of, plus they're trying to work. The stress level gets pretty high, so that makes them more vulnerable to having a longer or more severe reaction to the disaster. And then past or current mental health disorder or substance use disorder can actually increase their vulnerability. Disaster characteristics that increase the vulnerability to severe reactions. So this is the population exposure model. And it's basically, that kind of bullseye idea that the closer you are to the event, the more likely you are to have a more severe reaction. So obviously A is like where the primary impact statement is, or the impact area is. And then as you go further away from that impact area, people are more peripherally affected, but not as severely affected as a large community. And you really saw this really well after something like a 9/11, where the exterior communities and further distance you got from it had less of reactions as those that were closer to ground zero. A also includes, just so you know, the injured survivors, bereaved family members. It also includes and is people who had to be evacuated or who had to flee in order to save themselves. So that sense of terror that happens in there, and extreme fear, makes you a part of Group A, even if you were maybe a little bit further away from the actual impact zone. So typical behavioral health outcomes after a disaster. Some people will have some severe reactions. And our ability as providers in any community setting, whether it's as a part of a CCP grant program after disaster, whether it's part of our normal day-to-day operations in a clinic, hospital setting, wherever, school counselors, a little bit of support can go a long way in helping mitigate those severe reactions, but some will have some severe reactions. Very few will develop a diagnosable condition. Everybody talks about PTSD after disasters. Actually, depression is the biggest potential risk after depression. PTSD is a possibility, of course, but it isn't the only one. Most do not seek help or treatment. We always used to call the CCP stealth mental health because a lot of it is just normalizing the reactions, connecting them to available resources, which might include disaster recovery resources, but it might also include, here's where, there's a survivors, group support happening, or this is where where you can go if you do want to talk to somebody about what's happening, but most of them will not actively seek out. So that gets to why the CCP is as an outreach model. Survivors will often reject help, and they do, but they'll take help for their friend or their wife or their kids, or and so you can kind of work your way into providing help to everybody through that method, which is, well, I don't need anything. I'm doing fine, but my wife isn't doing so good. Okay, well, let's talk with. Do you think she'd talk with us? And then what do you know? We're helping both of them. And then stigma is less for a short time after that disaster, and people are more willing to accept behavioral health because we've normalized it and not pathologized it. We're not saying you're all going to be depressed. You're all, unfortunately, there's still a lot of misunderstanding about what diagnosis means in the mental health field or even in the substance use field. And so, but that stigma decreases when we talk about normal reactions to an abnormal situation. And we start teaching people how to realize and how to cope through things more effectively. And that, over time, things will return for them. Their coping skills, their natural coping skills will return and they'll feel stronger and better. So substance use in disasters, disruption of services. This came from a recent research study that actually SAMHSA DTAC put out. The Disaster Technical Assistance has a resource bulletin, a supplemental research bulletin that they put out as kind of a regular product, and where they take on a particular topic in disaster behavioral health. And last year in 2024, they took on substance use in disasters because it's not something that actually CCP's got a lot of criticism of various types over the years, but one of them I think they still struggle with is what to do with people with substance use disorder. They'll tell you we don't do treatment in that program at all. And I mean, if you think of treatment as a continuum, then yeah, they do. But if you're thinking very traditional, like office-based treatments, diagnostics, medications, anything like that, no, they don't. That doesn't mean they can't serve better substance use and disasters. But I think it's probably pretty hard to change, years and years and years of history of them being two separate fields, right? It's only been recently that we've started using behavioral health and kind of trying to encompass them in one and even co-locate and co-work together better. So they put out this research bulletin last year about the current state of research on substance use after disasters. And these are the three key points that I took away from that is the disruption of services impacts treatment initiation, decreases the receipt of services, and of course, reduced client retention. I would suspect that's probably true in mental health too, because there's a disruption overall. I think the risks, though, are a little bit different, and these are two key ones. One is it definitely increased the risk of overdose, and I had some particular stats for you on that one, which was pretty bad. World Trade Center found the World Trade Center study found that past or current PTSD experience increased the likelihood of opioid misuse over those who had never experienced PTSD. And then, interestingly, and I couldn't quite understand this one, I'm going to have to go find the original study, but individuals receiving treatment for PTSD had a higher rate of recent prescription opioid use compared to those not receiving PTSD. So I wish they had spent a little more time explaining that one. And then a post-Hurricane Maria study of individuals who inject drugs found a significant increase in drug use after Maria than before, 22.7% versus 3%. So that's a pretty significant increase in people using drugs after Maria. And then more individuals were using the same or sharing needles post-disaster versus before. And that was like 79% to 50%. So it was pretty significant that harm reduction efforts were also severely impacted. So how do we provide support more effectively after a disaster? Psychoeducation is about what's normal reactions versus when to be concerned. Actually goes a long way in helping people feel a little bit better about their reaction. And it gives them a sense of that feeling that they know now what to do if they observe something in someone else that maybe seems like it's beyond what a normal reaction might be expected, or it's lasting longer. The general counseling skills of validating their feelings, active listening, helping prioritize tasks and problem solve, and then connecting to other services and supports. and then enhancing their positive coping strategies or build new ones. Sometimes I found it was just reminding them of the ones they had before. They just become so overwhelmed they forget that they have been able to cope through tough things before. Well, what strategies worked then? Let's look at those and then see if we can enhance it a little bit for this, since it feels to you like that's not working this time. Um, so those are just some general ones that we can do. From a facilities perspective, I would have to say I love this little quote here, but it's not. When I say get out of the box, I mean get out of your office. We have to go and actually look for folks. People have been displaced. Oftentimes, their transportation services have been disrupted. We need to figure out how can we get to them before their condition deteriorates to the extent that we have the resources to do that. Can you extend your hours? Our clients are going to need to be able to attend to their recovery needs during business days, but that's when we typically are working as well. So how do we adjust our hours so that they have the ability to take care of both things? Can we provide, or is there any way we can provide transportation? Can we create a mobile program? Can you set up alternate locations, or co-locate with another human services organization temporarily to give people more access to your resources and your services? So that kind of leads us into the concept of the whole disaster response, which is not just an individual, it's not just one local organization, but can go from the local community that's impacted all the way up to the federal government and its resources. So it begins locally. It's coordinated by the Office of Emergency Management at your local community or county level. So if you're a very small community, you're probably under a county one. Large cities tend to have their own, separate from the county one. It just kind of depends on the resource needs and the area of coverage, the population, and of course the resources available to that jurisdiction to actually run an Office of Emergency Management. When the disaster exceeds local resources, then the state government assists, which I think most of us see kind of how that works. And then when a disaster impacts are beyond the local and state capacity, the federal government can provide resources and respond using what's called the National Response Framework. It is a fairly lengthy document, has an entire training series built around it. I've posted all of that at the end of this slide, so you'll have links to all of those things. But to give you kind of an overview of how the disaster framework works, again, it emphasizes the disaster response starting with the local community. Disaster programs through FEMA, and this gets back to kind of the two different programs, public assistance versus individual assistance. Public assistance is all the infrastructure, public facilities, debris removal, things like that. Individual assistance is about individuals and families. Housing, you may not know, but disaster unemployment assistance. And that is why after the pandemic, FEMA ended up declaring disasters for all 50 states in order to make available the crisis counseling program and unemployment insurance for disasters, which basically was a tool the government used to fund and to funnel money to individuals after the pandemic, especially once everybody went into the lockdown phase. SBA loans, as well as burial assistance, are another one. Housing is a couple of different things. Usually it's either rental assistance or it can be temporary housing that FEMA itself provides. It just depends on what the disaster is and what the local resources are available. For behavioral health emergency funds, there is the FEMA Crisis Counseling Program. That program supports hiring and training peers from the affected community to provide crisis counseling and support. So for the most part, it actually works really well. After Hurricane Katrina, I will be honest, there wasn't anybody left to hire. In fact, most of the mental health resources and substance use resources were gone because all of the facilities were destroyed and all the staff had to be evacuated. And they went to such diverse states, it wasn't easy for them to come back. So it took a long time. It was almost probably a year before the FEMA Crisis Counseling Program was able to get up and running because people hadn't returned enough yet. That's when SAMHSA was funding to send clinicians down on a cycle. So we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about the incident management system. American Red Cross has a disaster mental health program as well. It typically is usually local providers, it tends to be in place before the FEMA CCP program gets funded and up and running. And it is made up of licensed providers. They start with local, but they can bring some folks in if needed. And it tends to be very short term. We're talking maybe 2 to 4 weeks before they're probably moving back out. And then we have the SAMHSA Emergency Response Grants or the SURGE program. It's very much modeled after the CCP, but it can be applied for services for disasters and emergencies that do not qualify for a major disaster declaration. That wouldn't get funds from anywhere else. Typically, can be more public health oriented if necessary. So it was interesting after Katrina, they did actually, a couple of the states did actually get these two grants as well, in addition to the CCP programs. And part of it was it was able to kick in a little bit faster. And then the last one is the Department of Education has Project Serve grants. That's for schools' emergency response to violence. So this is a program that's specific for school shootings, and it does also encompass a mental health or behavioral health component to it. Now, I have to say there's got to be a caveat to this slide right now, because by law, all of these programs exist because they all have specific authorizations in law. But it would be a disservice not to recognize that, the government itself is undergoing a massive change right now with this administration putting different emphasis on different priorities, and some of these programs may not exist in the future simply because there's no funding for them. But for right now, obviously FEMA does. In fact, my understanding from my colleagues over at SAMHSA DTEC is Texas did apply for a CCP grant for the Central Texas floodings. So I'm sure they're working hard to get that up and running. All right, let's see. So the National Response Framework encourages state and communities to have all hazards response plans and to integrate continuity in those plans. So COOP is another type of acronym you could hear in a disaster. It's continuity of operations plans. We encourage any organization to have these. It's basically how would you function or how would you continue to run your business's essential services if something really bad were to happen? It could be something as a massive blackout for power. So all of your electronic health records are gone. You don't have access to them right now. What would you do instead? Do you have generators? Do you have an alternate location you could do? Do you have a data warehouse that you could ask that's stored somewhere else so that you could access it through, if you were able to get an internet connection somewhere, would you be able to get back to your records? Who is your key staff? What services are key? So obviously banking has key services, but as providers of human services, what are our key services? Are we able to provide them all? All the different things that we do during a disaster? Probably not. But what are the key ones that we must or should continue to do even in the face of a really daunting disaster? It describes how the federal government's going to supplement local and state resources by defining key roles and coordination structures. And then it's really set to collaborate to stabilize community lifelines and restore essential services. And that's, I think, a key emphasis even the current administration is still working on and working towards, is making sure that the federal government isn't there to replace, they're there to stabilize and make sure that your essential services keep the community safe, and like your hospitals, clean water is essential. How do we make sure that's protected? They do this through what's called the National Incident Management System. So this is a series of guides that helps organizations kind of figure out how to work through a unified command structure. And unified command structure is think of it as taking the incident command to the next level. But it includes operational guides, training, implementation, and regular exercises to test your readiness to respond using the incident command. So incident command is interesting. It was actually developed in the 1970s by the National Wildfire Service, yes, because this is the model that they use to suppress wildfires. but it's beneficial because it's scalable, it's flexible, it gives us a common language, it gives us a common set of position descriptions and functions so that we are all speaking the same language when we're trying to respond to a disaster. So everybody who works in disasters is trained to use this model. This is what a unified command would look like. And so multi-jurisdictional, you might have local incident commanders, state incident, federal incident commanders. So I'm going to show you a picture of SAMHSA's when I was working Hurricane Katrina. This looks like they may be sitting together. They may not be. They could be in different locations. It still works as a unified command system, though. So this is what it looked like during SAMHSA's response to Hurricane Katrina. So I know it looks complex, but there's SAMHSA's incident command is right here, which you can't see me pointing to because I don't know how to do that on this. But so the incident commander reports directly to the SAMHSA administrator as well as to the HHS operations center. We actually did deploy one staff down there to sit down there as well. And then all of our centers and policy office were involved in the planning function specifically. But we also talked to people like NASHBID and NAZADAD, and I hope you guys know what those are. If not, National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors, National Association of State Substance Abuse Directors, which I think is not quite the right acronym, but it's close, because they're important in giving us intelligence from what they're hearing from their field. The HHS Operations Center works directly with the FEMA National Response Coordination Center. That's actually where I worked when I first started at FEMA. That's where I worked during Hurricane Andrew before I started getting field assignments. It is a really impressive place to see. And if you wanted to check it out, you could find a couple of YouTube videos about that center specifically. I actually watched one of them. It's really well done. And that tiny little orange blob at the very front of that picture is me. I was the incident commander for Hurricane Katrina at SAMHSA. So how is it different from normal operations? I think this is really important. Why, if you haven't tried or thought about learning how to do this within your own organization, you should. In normal business, you obviously have many chains of commands, people reporting to each other. There are various disciplines now that are interested in kind of a matrixed point of view in terms of operations, but the reality is that's still a very complex chain of command. Overlapping authorities, overlapping responsibilities, and normal business tends to be kind of risk aversive. In incident command, you have one chain of command and one authority. And then your operations may include all of those things, but have streamlined procedures, and it's very risk tolerant. I was actually reporting directly to Charles Curry, was the administrator at the time, and I know it's now called assistant secretary, but he was the administrator at the time. And he used to say, don't let perfection be the enemy of good enough. Because the reality is when you're in that kind of chaotic environment, you don't have perfect data to work on. You have to be able to tolerate taking some risks and being a little bit bold in direction with your personnel assignments, with your logistics, with kind of policy decisions in order until better data comes in. It's the best you can. It's, so to speak, doing the best you can with the data you have at that moment and knowing it's going to change. This line of work's not for everybody, believe me. So if we think back to normal business operations versus disaster operations, in normal business, this was me buried way down there under CMHS in one of the divisions. So my interaction and contact with the SAMHSA administrator was pretty small. During the disaster operations, I'm now the incident commander and now overseeing people who really outrank me on a normal day-to-day business. And that's another really important concept that's really challenging with incident command, and that why people need to be trained, they need to exercise it because it's not for everybody. Just because somebody has a title on day-to-day business and might be the director of such and such doesn't actually mean they're good at directing in this type of response. So practice helps you learn that. And if they're not good, you need to be able to replace them because the command structure itself, but your disaster response will fail if you have the wrong people in the wrong positions. Was I the right one? I was the only one. And that is because up to that point, I was one of 3 people in the agency who had actually had any kind of incident command training. But I was also the only one who had ever served as an incident commander on any of them. And up to that point, it had been primarily the national top-off exercises, which the government used to test the incident command and stuff like that. But I have also done it on smaller scale disasters as an EMT. So how does this work for community behavioral health? I think because we're short on time, we're not going to do the case study, but it is going to be a part of the slides if you wanted to think it through. So I think I'm going to kind of just sum up for you where we are. Oh, let me go back up. Or what I think we really want to focus on after disaster is, one, is we want to take care of ourselves. I think, we can become so involved as providers, as caregivers in general. We work in a helping profession, that we can kind of forget to take care of ourselves. And this is a struggle for us probably on a day-to-day basis, but after a disaster, it becomes even more critical, because if you become sick yourself because you have not been able to manage your stress, or you've not been able to attend to your own recovery needs, you may have been impacted by the disaster too, you're not going to be as effective with anyone else. And so it's okay to say you need to take that break. And then it gives us the ability to actually normalize for other people that being overwhelmed, feeling sad, feeling grief, feeling angry is normal and will be profoundly helpful to them in being able to pull their natural resilience up. And that's really what we want to do. We don't want to take over. We just want to pull their ability to pull their own resilience up and escalate it to a point that helps them cope more effectively with this disaster, this new stressor in their life. And then getting involved, making sure you are part of any kind of local community disaster plan, all hazards planning, and knowing it is, making sure your organization has a continuity of operations plan, so you know what you're going to be able to do as critical functions during a disaster, whatever it might be. And then, taking these trainings that I put at the end of them, they're on, almost all of them are online. They're all free. You can learn more about psychological first aid, which is the model that we use in the crisis counseling program. There's a follow-on to that called Skills for Psychological Recovery. They're both free online. What they're different from mental health first aid is another one that's offered. One at charges. I think it's up to $35 a person now for that. So you have to have their certified instructors do it. But it's more of a general, just, I think of it as kind of like behavioral health 101 for the general population. Psychological first aid does a little bit of that, but it's more specific to the types of help people need specific to a disaster. So I think you'll find it more useful for the types of individuals you might be encountering and the types of experiences they might be having right after that disaster. In case you didn't know and you're looking to reach out to somebody to make connections, Chance Freeman is the director of Texas's Health and Human Services Commission. He's actually your state disaster behavioral health coordinator. He's been in that position for a long time. I've known him in that role. So that's one resource. The SAMHSA Disaster Technical Assistance Center has a ton of resources for how to talk to different populations about disasters and recovery. So I've got a link here for that as well. And then I'll let you look through the other resources, but these are some of the suggested trainings on both the National Response Plan. These are all through FEMA's Disaster University, I think they call it now, instead of the Emergency Management Institute. But they're free also as well. And so these are the recommended ones. These are all required for the federal government staff. They're also required, just so you know, for my fire and rescue. Everybody has to have these classes. So because we're going to be responders in that event too. And then you have the psychological first aid course I put up here as well. You'll also find the Skills for Psychological Recovery one as well right after that one. So questions? Boy, that went by fast.
I know, our time always flies by. Thank you so much, Brenda. This was very informative and lots of practical information. And as Brenda mentioned, everyone, don't worry about taking down the information quickly. Everyone's going to get the slides. We'll share all the links with you, so you'll have all that information. A few questions are coming in the Q&A. And folks want to continue to submit there, feel free. And what we don't get to, we can always take offline as well. But Brenda, I have one question for you that was sort of coming up for me as you were speaking before I run to the audience questions. Um, what should we keep in mind for water-related disasters specifically? I know you've worked a number of hurricanes. Obviously, here we're susceptible to floods and hurricanes and post-hurricane flooding, all of those things. What are kind of some nuances around water-related disasters that we should keep in mind as behavioral professionals?
Um, I honestly, I call it the disaster that keeps giving. Um, I think there's multiple impacts. One of them is, the event itself hits, straight riverine flooding. The events that hit later might be erosion or mudslides, because a lot of the stuff that holds dirt in place is gone. But it's the mold afterwards, getting things dried out. Safe drinking water is going to be essential, for anybody who's been affected. Where people are going to go to the bathroom. I mean, it's really practical, but I think from an emotional standpoint, it's the disaster. Those disasters tend to kind of keep having impacts. Hurricanes have that problem of there's a lot of lead up and a lot of warning that we don't have for other types of disasters sometimes, but they keep spawning other things. So you have not just the hurricane winds uh, providing a lot of debris, but then you have the storm surge, which then flows up to rivers, so it spreads out more than most people may realize. They also spawn tornadoes, so you can have basically multiple kinds of disasters occur within the same disaster, which is kind of re-impacting people. And I think that can really increase the intensity of not only the initial response and recovery effort, but also the intensity of reactions afterwards.
Thank you. We have a question here from Tamara. Do you find that people with a previous trauma history have more severe reactions that are tied to that previous trauma experience, and how do we navigate that?
That is a great question. So in general, I think most of the research has indicated that having a prior trauma history can make people more vulnerable. But trauma is so individual specific. It's not always clear what might have triggered a traumatic reaction. And you probably see that in the people you work with too, is that it's sometimes they're not even certain. I don't know why this came up all of a sudden. I thought I was good with this now. So disasters don't necessarily do that, but they can, and they can then have some pretty severe reactions. And I think we just need to be on the lookout for those and look out for things like severe avoidance behavior, hyperstartle, dissociation would indicate that they're probably having a pretty significant traumatic reaction, which could be new to that disaster, or it could be because it's triggered something else. And it would be worth probably getting them in to see somebody on a more professional treatment oriented basis than just what we would typically do after a disaster, which is provide a lot of support but not necessarily get into therapy.
Got it. And I think we have time for one more question, and I'll share some information about CEs because I know a number of people would need those credits. We have a question from Rebecca about the CCP training. Is that something they can do ahead of a disaster like they might do for Red Cross training? Could you say a little bit more about the crisis counseling training?
That's a great question because I think one of the biggest probably weaknesses of the CCP program is that we so to speak reinvent the wheel each time, and that's because every time when there's a disaster, we have to hire people and start again at the beginning. But some states are actually starting to keep registries of people who've been trained as crisis counselors in the past. In order to, like, New Jersey keeps one. I actually can't say if Texas does or not. I don't know. I would think they do simply because they've had so many. That they would have a pretty, at least a small core of people that are already well trained from different communities because they've had enough responses that they've gotten this training before, and they can refresh it. But in general, I don't know that there's anything happening across the states that says we're pre-training people. You could. There's just not the infrastructure or financial support to do it. And after a disaster, this is an employment program too, the CCP. We put people to work and we pay them for that work. It's sometimes harder to get people to do this work for free when there's no active disaster. There's no way to reimburse them. And I think that's a common problem I've heard across states in trying to keep people within those types of registries.
Got it. Okay, I see we are at time. I just want to echo Catherine's comment in the chat, this is very interesting. She can see that we still all have so much to learn. So I can promise everyone we will bring this topic to our symposium this coming year and hopefully other opportunities as well. So Brenda, I just want to thank you for your time. This was incredibly informative. I know you're open to sharing your contact information with folks, so we will share that in our post-session survey. And for those of you needing CE credits, you'll find that link in the chat to complete your post-session survey. Be sure to do that if you need those credits. And otherwise, we'll wrap up and just thank you again, Brenda. This was incredibly helpful for our community.
Thank you for the privilege of being here with you today. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. See lots of hearts. Thanks all.